Welcome back. In this unit, we're going to be looking at markets in personal data. And specifically, we're going to be looking at ways in which markets and data may be unjustifiable or what Pham and Castro call noxious. Next slide. The overview of this mini lecture, this series of mini lectures, is as follows. We're going to first look at moral effects of markets and data. We'll be looking at that by considering the question of what markets actually are. There's different ways to construe markets, but I'll give a kind of rough and ready understanding of what markets are in order to set up our discussion. Next, we will examine the question or look at the fact that markets are structured by values and values permeate markets. Oftentimes people think of them as kind of existing in a merely descriptive way, that is, they just come about. But in fact, all kinds of value questions are in all parts of any kind of market that one can imagine. We will move from there to consider, once we've opened up this possibility or opened up this understanding that values structure and permeate markets, we can examine whether those are good or bad, right? Whether the values that actually structure particular markets are themselves justifiable or not, or whether they are noxious in the term in the article that we read. And then we will turn specifically to certain kinds of data markets, markets in personal data. Next slide. So what are markets? Well, markets we can just think of as sites of exchange, right? There's some place where people can exchange or organizations can exchange some things for other things. Often it is goods for cash or cash substitutes. So if you go to a store and buy some goods and exchange money for it, that's a market. It might be exchanges of services for money, or there might be exchanges of securities, or any other manner of exchange. It doesn't really matter, right? All markets are sites. They don't have to be physical sites. They can just be they can be virtual sites, or they can operate at a distance, right? They're just mechanisms or sites of exchange. And commercial markets, not all markets have to be commercial, but commercial markets are sites of exchange where the goal of where people have the goal of seeking some kind of advantage. That doesn't mean seeking an advantage over another person, but seeking an advantage for themselves. They can enter into mutually beneficial agreements. For example, I might want to sell you a good and you might want to buy that good, and I might want that cash. So we can mutually benefit from that kind of exchange. That's distinct from other kinds of what I think of as metaphorical markets. So some of you may have heard the phrase marketplace of ideas, and the idea is that that in a community or in a society there might be some exchange of views, and people will debate those or disagree and express disagreement, and that is a sort of marketplace, but it isn't the kind of exchange in a literal sense that that commercial markets actually are. Next slide. Now, this is a pretty rough and ready, right? This is a very basic understanding of what a market is. That we could get much more sophisticated. We don't need to here, right? The point is just that markets exist in commercial spaces. They can exist in lots of different goods and services and entities and securities and things like that. But the thing to notice, or the thing to take into account for the purposes of our discussion, is to note that markets are themselves based on or dependent on other kinds of social structures. So, for example, markets may depend upon a currency. Right? If there's going to be money exchanged, then there needs to be some kind of agreement, some kind of norm, often backed by a government, of some kind of currency. There needs to be some kind of understanding of units of measure. So if you're buying food and you don't have an agreed upon unit of measure of weight or mass, then you will not be able to ensure that you are getting what you hope in the exchange. There need to be norms of good faith, right? Markets can't function if there is pervasive fraud, right? So if you know that most sellers tend to offer counterfeit goods or pretend to sell you one thing but sell something else, or give cash that isn't really cash, it's counterfeit bills, things like that, then markets will tend to collapse, right? They just won't function, right? So there's some norm of basic good faith in bargaining, right? And this is true even if there are pretty strong legal and contractual norms, right? Because if somebody's always playing on the sharp end of a contract, always trying to get the very, very last little concession out of a contract, it's just sort of frustrating and counterproductive to work with that person over time. Right? There is a super important structure for markets to function, that there needs to be some kind of body or some kind of mechanism to adjudicate disputes. It's not always obvious who's right in disputes over exchanges. And resolving those requires some kind of mechanism, right? Markets in contemporary senses depend on some kind of property, right? So some kind of understanding that one person either owns products of their labor or their services that they can render via their labor, or physical stuff or land or real property or intellectual property that can be exchanged, right? So if there's no law protecting my physical property and somebody else can just take it, well then there's not much market for me to be able to sell it. Likewise with intellectual property, right? The Google trade name is valuable in part, or largely, because it is protected. If just anybody could go out and use the name Google, then it would not be worth a great deal for the Google Corporation to have it, right? To use it to ply their services, their goods and services, because other people would have access to it, right? So the value is in part created, or value is a function of something being protected. And so that value that's protected becomes a thing that can be exchanged within a market, right? So all kinds of things structure markets. Next slide. Now, so what? Well, the fact that markets are based on other kinds of structures, on property, on currencies, on notions of good faith and fair dealing, on bodies that adjudicate things and so forth, means that markets will necessarily incorporate values. So consider, for example, the idea of bargaining good faith, right? That is a value that people will try to abide the things that they say they will do. They will be relatively forthright and honest, and markets will instantiate to a greater or lesser degree that value. Another value that is instantiated within markets is the idea that disputes warrant some kind of resolution, or some kind of peaceful and mutually agreeable resolution mechanism. If it always just came down to threats of, say, violence, then markets tend to fall apart and not function, right? So this idea that things should be mutually agreeable is a value that is instantiated into markets. Likewise, property, right? The idea that Google can protect its trade name, or that you and I can protect pieces of physical property, are ways, and the degree to which those are going to be protected and what rights those confer are based on some kind, or they instantiate, they reflect some kind of value, right? You can allocate property rights in different kinds of ways, and those will advance or hinder different opportunities for different groups of people, right? And that is a way in which a value gets incorporated into a market. Next slide. Now, so what we've seen is a definition of market. We've seen that markets are based on certain kinds of structures, and those structures will reflect or instantiate certain kinds of values. But markets and values intersect in other ways too. A different way that markets and values intersect is that some markets are simply incoherent, right? So some things are of a type of value that a market in those things is literally impossible, right? Recall, commercial markets are sites of exchange for individual advantage, right? That's what we've stipulated. It's true. But consider then a market in something like friendship. Well, if you think about what a friend is, a friend is somebody who wants to engage with you or their friend for because they like you, because they enjoy you, they are interested in you, they're interested in your well-being. They do not do it for personal advantage. Right? They do it because that's just a social thing that people do, and they like it. Now, certainly friends do benefit us. We benefit in terms of our well-being, in terms of our happiness, but we cannot buy that kind of advantage in our well-being and our happiness. Rather, it is the kind of thing that only happens within a context of some kind of mutual friendship. It's just the kind of thing that is not, once it is paid for, that is, once you are trying to get an advantage of having somebody be your friend by paying them, and they are acting a certain way towards you because you pay them, then it is no longer a friendship at all. They're doing it for commercial reasons, not because they're interested in you, not because of some kind of mutual affection or mutual regard, right? So a market in friendship is just incoherent. Now, that doesn't mean that one could not ever say employ someone who is a friend, right? But you can't employ them to be your friend and have it actually be a friendship, right? So friendship is just a thing that in which a market is incoherent. So one way in which kind of moral categories, friendship, are relevant to markets, namely that kind of moral relationship is antithetical to there being a market in it. Now, there are other kinds of ways in which markets may conflict with ideals. So, for example, this is an example from Pham and Castro, and that is, say, a market in votes. So, the idea of voting within a democratic system is that people want to vote for leaders and policies and laws and actions that they agree with and that they think are right. And perfecting a market in votes, that is being able to sell votes, would mean that people are entering the vote for a much narrower set of interests. Now, it's certainly coherent to have a market in votes, right? It doesn't make a category mistake like a market in friendship. However, it is incompatible with the values underwriting democracy. If there's markets and votes, a democracy would not actually be a democracy. It would be a market. Right. So two different things. So markets and votes undermine some different value, namely democracy. Next slide. Now, some markets may be coherent. They may not undermine some other institution, like the way that a market in votes might undermine a market in, or a market of votes might undermine the value of democracy. Rather, they can just be bad in their own right. So some facts about particular markets may make them so bad that they ought to be either extinguished or very tightly controlled. So consider something like a market in organs. Kidneys, livers, hearts, limbs, skin, whatever. Certainly it's possible that there could be markets, and in some cases there are markets in organs like that. However, the sorts of circumstances that lead people to sell organs are very dire, and it puts people in extremely risky positions, oftentimes for money that is they could plausibly gain in other ways, right? So it puts people in positions to really harm themselves and others close to them, right? So, or to harm other people in order to induce organ sale, right? So, so that's a market that may just be bad and hence ought to be tightly curtailed or extinguished altogether. Likewise, child labor, right? It's totally coherent to have a market in child labor. Indeed, many places in the world right now, there are markets in child labor. It has been that way in this country for in its past. That is mostly illegal and relatively uncommon now. But the idea is that by having a market in which children can sell their labor is bad for their overall well-being, and it creates a sort of social structure where lots of people end up failing to flourish, not able to have a childhood that is particularly enjoyable, not have a childhood in which they can get educated and do what they will within their lives, and create kind of flourishing lives over the long haul. Moreover, children just tend to have very much less bargaining power, so they often get paid much less than adults, right? So a child labor market might be considered so bad, in fact, is in this country considered so bad that it ought to be extinguished. So we'll stop there for this mini lecture, and we'll get into specific criteria for noxious markets and explications of data markets in the next mini lecture.